The Tuesday morning quiet at Ridgemont Federal broke the moment Ethan Cole walked through the glass doors. He was wearing a faded denim jacket, work boots, still carrying traces of dried compound, and he carried nothing but a plain envelope. He stepped up to the counter and asked to transfer $6 million from a legal inheritance. Branch manager Melissa Grant let out a short laugh before asking if he meant $6,000. The entire lobby went still. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He simply laid the documents on the counter. Then the front door opened again, and a woman in a tailored coat turned to face him across the lobby and said one word. "Sir." Melissa's face went white. Ethan Cole had been up since 5 that morning. Not because he had anywhere urgent to be, but because that was the hour his body had trained itself to wake after 2 decades of early job calls and pre-dawn drives across town with a truck bed full of pipe fittings. He made coffee, sat at the kitchen table for a while without turning on any lights, and then pulled the envelope from the top drawer where he had kept it for the past 3 weeks. He turned it over in his hands, once set it down, and finished his coffee. The drive to Ridgemont Federal took 20 minutes. He parked in the side lot, walked through the glass front doors just after 9 in the morning, and stood for a moment while his eyes adjusted to the air-conditioned interior. The lobby was quiet, the way bank lobbies always were, a particular kind of silence that felt managed, deliberate, like volume itself had been regulated somewhere behind the walls. A few tellers stood at their stations. A security guard near the door gave him a brief nod. Ethan nodded back and walked toward the main counter. He had worn what he wore most days, a faded denim jacket over a plain gray shirt, dark work pants, and a pair of boots that had seen better years. He wasn't dressed for a meeting or a presentation. He was dressed like a man who had stopped at the bank on the way to a job site, which in most circumstances was exactly the kind of man he was. The envelope was the only thing that didn't fit the picture, sealed clean, carrying the name of a law firm printed in the upper left corner. The teller at the counter glanced at him, then gestured toward the manager's desk at the far side of the lobby. A small sign identified it. Branch Manager Melissa Grant. The teller said something about large transfer requests requiring manager approval. Ethan thanked her and walked over. Melissa Grant looked up from her monitor when he approached. She was a woman in her mid-40s, sharply dressed with the kind of composed expression that came from years of managing a space where the presentation of authority mattered more than most things. She took in his jacket, his boots, the envelope in his hand, and her expression didn't change, but something behind it did. The assessment happened in less than 2 seconds, and Ethan had been assessed enough times in his life to recognize it. He told her he needed to initiate a wire transfer, $6 million from an estate account following the settlement of his late father's will. He placed the envelope on the desk and said she would find everything in order inside the probate documents, the account verification letters, the authorization from the estate attorney, and 2 forms of identification. Melissa picked up the envelope without opening it. She looked at him again, at his jacket, specifically at the faint line of dried compound, still visible on the left cuff, and asked in a tone that carried just enough lightness to make it deniable whether he was certain about the amount. $6 million, he had said. Was that correct? Or did he perhaps mean 6,000? The question landed the way she likely intended it to, as a polite correction, disguised as a clarification. Ethan looked at her steadily and confirmed the amount. $6 million. He then asked her to open the envelope. She opened it. She removed the documents one by one and laid them on the desk, scanning each page with the practiced speed of someone who expected to find something wrong. The probate court order was there. The estate account details were there. The attorney's transfer authorization was there. His identification was there. Every document was in order, properly notarized, with no missing signatures and no expired dates. Melissa set the last page down and looked at him again. She said that given the size of the transfer, the branch would need to conduct what she called an enhanced verification process. It wasn't standard protocol for transfers of this documentation quality. Ethan knew enough about banking procedure to understand that, but she said it with the calm authority of someone who was counting on him not to know the difference. She told him it would likely take several days, possibly longer, and suggested he leave his contact information so they could follow up. There was nothing openly hostile about any of it. That was the particular skill of it. Every sentence she spoke had a clean procedural surface, but underneath it, the message was clear enough she was not going to make this easy for him, and she was not especially concerned about whether he noticed. Ethan sat across from her for a moment without speaking. He thought about his father, about a man who had spent 40 years getting up early, working with his hands, saying little, and being underestimated in nearly every room he ever walked into. He thought about the fact that his father had understood something that most people around him never did, that dignity was not something you were given by the room. It was something you already had, and the room was simply wrong when it failed to recognize it. He asked calmly whether he could speak with someone above her in the organization, a regional supervisor, or anyone with the authority to process the transfer without the additional delay. Melissa's expression settled into something that was almost a smile. She told him without warmth that she was the highest authority in this branch. Any decisions about account processing were hers to make. If he had concerns about the timeline, he was welcome to submit a written inquiry through the main customer service portal. Ethan looked at the documents still spread across her desk. He looked at her once more. Then he picked up the envelope, folded the documents back inside, and stood up. He thanked her for her time, and he walked back across the lobby toward the exit. The security guard near the door didn't look up this time. The tellers at the counter kept their eyes forward. No one said anything. He pushed through the glass doors and stepped out into the morning air. His truck was where he had left it, parked in the side lot with a length of copper pipe visible through the rear window. He stood beside it for a moment, the envelope in his hand, the sounds of the street settling around him. He was not angry. That was the thing that might have surprised people who assumed someone in his position would be. He was not angry. He was simply clear about what had just happened, about what it meant, and about what he intended to do next. He got in the truck, set the envelope on the passenger seat, and drove. After Ethan left the lobby at Ridgemont Federal, returned to its regulated quiet. The tellers went back to their screens. The security guard resumed his position near the door. From the outside, the branch looked exactly as it always did, orderly, controlled, professional, in all the visible ways that mattered to the people in charge of how it looked. Melissa walked back to her desk, straightened the papers on its surface, and said nothing for several minutes. Then she got up and moved along the row of teller stations, stopping at 2 of them long enough to say what she wanted said. She kept her voice low, conversational, the way she always did when she was establishing a version of events before any other version could take hold. The man who had just been in, she told them, had presented documentation that warranted extra scrutiny. She said the situation had the markings of a common fraud pattern: inflated estate claims, fabricated transfer authorizations. She said she had handled it correctly, and that if anyone asked, that was the answer. One of the tellers, a younger woman named Dana, who had been at the branch for just under a year, looked down at the counter without responding. She had watched the whole exchange from her station. She had seen Ethan hand over the documents, had seen Melissa's face before she even opened the envelope, and she understood the way people in rooms like that always understand, even when they say nothing, that the sequence had gone in the wrong direction. The decision had been made before the documents were ever read, but Dana said nothing. She nodded once and went back to her screen. The other teller, Melissa, spoke to a man named Frank, who had been at the branch for 11 years, kept his expression professionally blank throughout. He had seen Melissa manage situations this way before. He had learned over those 11 years that the cost of contradiction was never worth what it bought. So he too nodded and said nothing. The morning continued. Customers came in, completed their transactions, and left. The lobby hummed along at its ordinary pace. Melissa returned to her desk and resumed her day as though the earlier hour had been entirely routine, which in her version of it, it had. It was close to noon when the black sedan pulled into the parking lot. Nobody at the front of the branch noticed it immediately. The vehicle parked quietly in a visitor space near the main entrance, and the woman who stepped out of it moved without announcement. No prior call to the front desk, no email flagged to management that morning, no scheduled visit on the branch calendar. Charlotte Bennett operated that way by design. She had been the regional director for Ridgemont Federal's Western District for 6 years, and she had learned early in that role that announced inspections produced performances, not information. What she needed was information. She had been receiving complaints about this particular branch for several months. Not the kind of complaints that came through the formal channels. Most customers who felt they had been dismissed didn't bother with forms, but the informal kind, the ones that found their way to her through referrals and community feedback, and occasionally through the estate attorneys and financial advisors who processed accounts at multiple institutions and noticed when one of them operated differently from the others. The pattern at this branch was consistent enough to warrant a visit, so she made one. Charlotte walked through the glass doors in a charcoal blazer and dark slacks, carrying a leather folio and nothing else. She was in her early 50s, with the kind of composed, unhurried presence that came not from authority alone, but from the specific experience of having walked into rooms where she was underestimated, and leaving them having made every point she came to make. She stopped just inside the entrance and took in the lobby, the layout, the staff positions, the queue at the teller stations, with the practiced read of someone cataloging a space before she decided how to move through it. One of the junior staff members recognized her first. The branch didn't receive regional director visits often, and when they happened unannounced, the information moved through the room quickly. Within 30 seconds of Charlotte stepping inside, Dana had looked up from her station, recognized the face from the company directory photo, and felt something shift in the air of the lobby. Melissa was already moving toward the entrance by the time Charlotte had crossed half the lobby floor. Her expression was controlled, but the speed at which she had stood from her desk and started walking was not quite as controlled as she intended it to be. She introduced herself and extended her hand, and Charlotte shook it without particular warmth, the way someone does when they are being courteous rather than welcoming. Charlotte said she was doing a standard operational review of several branches in the district. She said she had a few questions about account processing procedures and would appreciate some time with the branch records. Melissa said, of course, and gestured toward her desk with a practiced smile. They sat, and Charlotte opened her folio and asked several procedural questions in sequence. Staffing levels, customer processing, times, complaint, resolution, rates, escalation protocols. Melissa answered each one smoothly, with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed for exactly this kind of visit, even when it was supposed to be unexpected. It was only when Charlotte set down her pen and looked up from the folio that the direction of the conversation changed. Charlotte said she had received a specific account of an incident that morning. A customer had come in to initiate a wire transfer using a fully documented estate settlement. The customer had been asked to submit to an extended review process that was not standard for documentation of that type, and had left the branch without completing the transaction. She asked Melissa to walk her through what had happened. Melissa's composure held. She said the customer had presented materials that raised procedural flags, documents that required additional authentication, given the size of the transfer. She said her decision to implement enhanced verification had been made strictly within her authority as branch manager, and that the bank's risk management guidelines clearly allowed for discretionary review in cases of this nature. She chose her language carefully. Procedural flags, risk management guidelines, discretionary review. Words that sounded like policy. Words that were designed to end the conversation before it began. Charlotte listened to all of it without expression. Then she asked to see the customer's documentation. Melissa said the customer had taken the documents with him when he left. Charlotte looked at her for a moment, then asked whether a copy had been made before the customer departed standard procedure for any file flagged for enhanced review. Melissa said that in the course of the interaction, she had not had the opportunity to make copies. Charlotte wrote something in her folio and said nothing. What neither of them knew in that moment was that Ethan Cole had not gone far. He had driven around the block twice, parked again on the street outside, and spent 20 minutes in his truck, weighing what he already knew, which was that walking away and calling the estate attorney was the rational choice, the clean choice, the choice his father would have called the long game. But he had also spent his life watching people choose the long game on behalf of other people who didn't know it was being played on their behalf. And he had grown tired of the assumption that patience was the same thing as acceptance. He took the envelope from the passenger seat, got out of the truck, and walked back through the glass doors. The lobby was different than when he had left it. There was a stillness to it that felt purposeful rather than routine, and it took him a moment to locate the source. At the far end of the room at Melissa's desk, 2 women were seated: Melissa and a woman in a charcoal blazer, whose posture and folio and the particular quality of Melissa's expression across from her told Ethan without needing any other information that the dynamic in that room had shifted. He stood near the entrance, not approaching. Dana at the nearest teller station looked up and saw him. She looked at the desk, then back at him, and made the smallest possible motion, with her eyes a directional glance, brief and deliberate, that said, "Stay." Charlotte saw him first. She looked across the lobby at the man in the faded denim jacket carrying a sealed envelope, and then looked back at Melissa and asked if that was the customer in question. Melissa turned in her chair. Something moved through her expression that she could not fully manage in time. She said that it was. Charlotte walked across the lobby herself, and introduced herself to Ethan by her full name and title. She asked if he still had his documentation with him. Ethan said he did. She asked if he would be willing to let her review it. He said yes, and handed her the envelope. She opened it at Melissa's desk with both of them present. She went through each document the way someone goes through a file when they already know what they're looking for, not the content, but the quality. The notarization seals, the court stamps, the attorney letterhead, the account routing confirmation from the estate bank, the identification. She read each page, fully set it down, and moved to the next. It took her approximately 8 minutes. When she finished, she squared the documents, placed them neatly back in the envelope, and set it on the desk in front of Ethan. The lobby had gone completely still by then. Dana was not pretending to look at her screen. Frank at the far station had stopped typing. Even the security guard near the door was standing differently. Charlotte turned to Ethan and said in a voice that was clear and even and carried exactly as far as she intended it to. "Thank you for your patience, sir. These documents are fully in order. We'll process your transfer today." Then she turned to Melissa. What followed was not loud. Charlotte had no need to raise her voice. The weight of what she was saying did not require volume to land. She told Melissa that her conduct toward this customer did not reflect the bank's standards, that the decision to delay a fully documented transfer without procedural basis and to characterize the customer's materials as suspicious constituted discriminatory treatment, and that she was placing Melissa on immediate administrative suspension pending a formal review. She said it the way she said everything, without anger, without theater, with only the clean, unambiguous directness of someone who had already decided and was now simply informing. Melissa said nothing. There was nothing useful to say, and she was at least experienced enough to understand that. She sat with her hands flat on the desk surface and her eyes on the middle distance while Charlotte spoke, and when Charlotte finished, Melissa nodded once in the mechanical way of someone absorbing something they cannot yet fully process. Charlotte then turned back to Ethan, and the quality of her voice changed, not warmer exactly, but more direct in a different way. She asked him to follow her to the conference room, where she would personally oversee the initiation of his transfer and make sure everything was completed before he left the building. Ethan picked up the envelope from the desk. He didn't look at Melissa as he stood. He followed Charlotte across the lobby, past the teller stations, past Dana, who was looking at her screen again, past Frank, who had finally resumed typing. At the door to the conference room, Ethan looked back at the lobby. Once at the particular quality of silence it held, now different from the managed silence it had carried all morning. Then he walked inside. The conference room at the back of Ridgemont Federal was small and deliberately neutral, a rectangular table, 4 chairs, a wall-mounted screen, and a window that faced the parking lot rather than the street. It was the kind of room designed to contain conversations, not to make them comfortable. Charlotte sat across from Ethan and set her folio open between them. She asked one of the junior staff to bring in the transfer processing system on a laptop, and within a few minutes the mechanics of what should have happened hours ago were finally underway. Charlotte worked through the transfer documentation with the focused efficiency of someone who had processed complex account transactions many times and found nothing unusual about this one. She verified the estate account number against the probate court order. She confirmed the routing details with the originating institution by phone, speaking to someone on the other end, with the calm, direct language of a person who did not need to establish credibility. It was already assumed. She initialed each verification step on a printed form and dated it in the corner, and then she slid the form across the table for Ethan to review before signing. Ethan read through it carefully. He had always read things carefully. Contracts, invoices, job estimates, the fine print on materials warranties. His father had taught him that, not in a formal way, not as a lesson with a beginning and an end, but through repetition and example over many years of watching a man who trusted very little to assumption. He signed where Charlotte indicated initialed the verification line and set the pen down. Charlotte confirmed the transaction had been submitted and provided him with a reference number and a written confirmation printout. She told him the funds would reflect in his receiving account within 1 to 2 business days standard for an interstate transfer of this classification. She told him she was sorry for what had happened that morning. Ethan looked at the confirmation sheet in his hands. The number on it, $6 million printed cleanly in a standard transaction font, looked in that moment less like money and more like a document his father had spent a lifetime earning without ever seeing. He thought about that for a moment before he spoke. He told Charlotte about his father. Not everything there wasn't time, and it wasn't that kind of room, but enough. His father's name had been Gerald Cole, and Gerald Cole had worked as a warehouse loader for most of his adult life, hauling freight for a regional distribution company that paid him an hourly wage and expected him to be grateful for the consistency of it. He had worked that job for 31 years. He had lived in the same house for most of that time, driven the same model of truck in successive iterations, and spent very little on anything that wasn't necessary. What Gerald had done quietly without announcing it to anyone was invest, not aggressively, not with the kind of portfolio that required a financial advisor and quarterly reviews, but steadily index funds a small amount of real estate purchased in the early 1990s, when the market in their part of the state was soft reinvested dividends across several decades. He had understood something that most people who looked at him never would have guessed, that time applied consistently to modest amounts produced results that surprised even people who considered themselves financially sophisticated. Gerald had never looked wealthy. He had never spent as though he were. But by the time he died at 73, the quiet arithmetic of his life had accumulated into something that neither Ethan nor anyone who knew Gerald would have predicted from the outside. Charlotte listened to all of it without interrupting. When Ethan finished, she said that the bank's failure that morning, Melissa's failure specifically, but also the failure of the institution to have caught this pattern earlier, was exactly the kind of thing that caused real harm to real people. Not dramatic harm, not the kind that made news, but the persistent low-grade harm of a system that told certain people through the texture of everyday interactions that they didn't belong in certain rooms, that their presence required more justification than other people's, that the default assumption when someone like Ethan walked through a door was doubt rather than service. She said she had been trying to address that pattern in this district for longer than the situation should have required. This morning, she said, was going to be the clearest case she had put into the formal record, and it would be used to make the argument she had been making for some time, about how the branch operated and why it needed to change. Ethan nodded. He didn't say much in response to that it wasn't his battle to manage, and he knew it. What he said instead was that he had made a decision about a portion of his father's money. He had been thinking about it for weeks, since before the probate settlement was finalized, and what had happened that morning had only made him more certain. He wanted to set aside a portion of the inheritance he had settled on $500,000 to begin to establish a community fund specifically for working people in the area who needed financial support that traditional institutions were unlikely to provide. Emergency assistance for people facing unexpected medical costs or equipment loss, or the kind of sudden gap between stability and collapse that most wage workers carried with them every day, and that most financial products were not designed to address. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. She said that was a serious undertaking, and that he would need proper legal and financial guidance to structure it correctly. Ethan said he was already in contact with the estate attorney about the framework. He said he wasn't in a hurry. He had spent enough of his life watching his father do things the right way and the slow way, and he had absorbed enough of that to understand the difference between a good idea executed carelessly and the same idea built to last. Charlotte said she thought Gerald Cole would have understood exactly what his son was doing with what he had left behind. Ethan looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. He said he hoped so. They wrapped up the remaining paperwork. Charlotte walked him back through the lobby, which had rearranged itself in the hour since he had first walked back through the front door. Melissa was no longer at her desk. Charlotte had asked her to wait in a separate room before the administrative review process could be formally initiated. Dana was still at her station, and when Ethan passed her on the way out, she looked up briefly and gave him a small, direct nod, the kind that didn't require words and didn't ask for anything in return. He walked out into the afternoon. The sun was higher now than when he had first arrived, and the parking lot was warmer than he expected. He stood beside his truck for a moment, the confirmation printout folded in his jacket pocket, and felt the particular kind of quiet that comes not from the absence of noise, but from the resolution of something that had been unresolved. He drove home, made another cup of coffee, and called his attorney. 1 week later, Ethan returned to Ridgemont Federal. The appointment had been scheduled through the branch's main line confirmed the day before by a staff member he didn't recognize, and when he walked through the glass doors on that second Tuesday morning, the first thing he noticed was that the desk at the far side of the lobby, the one with the small nameplate that had read Branch Manager Melissa Grant, had a different nameplate on it. Now, the name on it was Robert Hale. The man sitting behind it was younger than Melissa by at least 15 years, and when he looked up and saw Ethan approaching, he stood without being asked. Robert Hale introduced himself and said he had been briefed on Ethan's account, and that all remaining documentation for the fund establishment had been prepared in advance. He had spoken with the estate attorney's office the previous afternoon. He said to make sure the process today would be as efficient as possible. He said it the way someone says something when they genuinely mean it, not the way Melissa had said her procedural words, which had always been performing the shape of professionalism without its substance. They worked through the remaining paperwork at a table in the same conference room where Charlotte had processed the original transfer. It took less than 40 minutes. The documents for the community fund's initial account structure were signed and filed. The fund had been given a formal name, the Gerald Cole Community Fund, and the $500,000 seed allocation had been designated to a separate operating account with a set of disbursement guidelines that the attorney had drafted over the previous 5 days. When they finished, Robert Hale shook Ethan's hand and said the branch was glad to have him as a client. He said it plainly without theater, and Ethan believed him. On his way out, Ethan stopped at the teller counter for a moment. Dana was there again, at the same station she had occupied the week before. She recognized him immediately. He thanked her not for anything specific that he named, but in the way that conveyed specificity anyway, and she said she was glad things had worked out. There was a brief, uncomplicated exchange between two people who had shared a difficult morning and were now 7 days later standing on the other side of it. He was almost at the door when Charlotte walked in. She had another visit scheduled at the branch that morning, part of the ongoing operational review she had initiated following the previous week's incident. She saw Ethan near the exit and altered her path slightly to intercept him. Unhurried, as though the timing were entirely reasonable. Charlotte asked how the fund paperwork had gone. Ethan told her it was done, that the account was open, and that the first round of applications would be accepted, starting the following month. She said that was faster than she had expected, and he said his father had never been the kind of man who let good intentions sit in a drawer. Charlotte smiled at that, a real one, briefly, before her expression returned to its characteristic composure. She said she wanted him to know that the internal review of the branch had been completed and that the findings were being incorporated into a broader set of procedural changes across several locations in the district. She said she couldn't discuss the specifics of Melissa's case, but she said what had happened here would not be treated as an isolated incident. Ethan said he understood and that he appreciated her telling him. Charlotte looked at him for a moment, in the way that people sometimes look at someone when they are trying to find the right word for what they want to say, and settling finally on something simpler than what they started with. She said she hoped the fund did good work. She said that the people it was designed to reach, people who worked hard, saved carefully, and still found themselves standing in rooms where the default assumption ran against them, were exactly the people that institutions like hers too often failed, and that someone building something to address that gap from the outside was doing work that mattered. Ethan thanked her. He pushed through the glass doors and stepped outside. The morning was clear, and the street was busy with the ordinary movement of a Tuesday delivery trucks idling at curbs, people crossing at the light, a woman walking a dog that kept stopping to inspect the base of every parking meter. Ethan stood on the sidewalk outside Ridgemont Federal and watched it for a moment before he walked to his truck. He had a job at 11, a residential property on the east side, a pipe replacement in the basement that the homeowner had been putting off for 2 months. He had the parts already loaded in the truck bed. He would drive there, do the work, come home. He would probably stop for coffee on the way. It was in every visible sense a Tuesday, exactly like any other Tuesday, in a life built from the accumulation of ordinary days. But the envelope that had sat in the top drawer of his kitchen table for 3 weeks was gone now. The transaction was complete. The fund was open. Gerald Cole's name was on a document that would outlast the conversation it had taken to put it there. And Ethan Cole, a plumber from an unremarkable street in an unremarkable part of the country, had walked into a room that had decided before he opened his mouth what kind of man he was, and had walked back out, still knowing exactly who he was, which had always been the point. His father had known something that the Melissa Grants of the world would likely never understand, no matter how many lobbies they managed or how many assessments they made in the 2 seconds before a conversation began. The knowing of a person, the real knowing, the kind that held up under scrutiny, had nothing to do with what they were wearing when they walked through the door. It had to do with what they did when the room got it wrong, and Gerald Cole had spent a lifetime showing his son what that looked like quietly and without explanation, in the hope that the lesson would take. It had. Ethan got in the truck, checked the time, and pulled out into the street.